Good evening. Thank you for joining us for another of our Teleworks online lectures. This is actually a lecture demonstration. And before we begin, I should like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501(c)(3) not-for-profit organization. We're currently in our Spring 3, our Spring 3 session is about to start next week. We offer a variety of fine art drawing and painting classes in a variety of mediums, both online and in studio. We also offer classes in digital painting, and details can be found on our website, theatelier@flowerfield.org. And Atelier is spelled A-T-E-L-I-E-R, in case you were wondering. Our current exhibition is Lockdown and Beyond, and that has now been extended until June 15th. After that, we will be running another exhibition of student and staff work called Breakout, and that is scheduled to open on July 1st. Tonight's lecture demonstration is being sponsored by First Republic Private Wealth Management. And tonight, one of our instructors, Elizabeth Fusco, will be giving a lecture and demonstration illustrating the methods and techniques of botanical illustration and talking about the influences on her own work. We welcome her this evening. We hope you enjoy tonight's lecture demo. And if you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room and we will get to them at the end of the demonstration. I shall now hand over to Elizabeth Fusco. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you, Gabby, for the introduction, and thank you to the Atelier for inviting me to do this lecture. So I would like to tell you a little bit about myself first. I have studied art and been painting for probably my whole life. I do have my master's in art, and I pretty much started off with oil painting. So I do work in both oils and watercolor. I do a lot of still life and landscape, but my favorite thing to paint is botanical illustration. I am obsessed with flowers. I have a very large garden. I just love flowers. They've always interested me. So I began taking the course at the New York Botanical Garden and just continued on. So I do teach botanical illustration at the Atelier in watercolor. That's the most of the media that I use is watercolor for botanical. So I'm going to just share a little bit of background information about botanical art. Just bear with me while I get my presentation. So botanical art, what is botanical art? So there's a quote by Wilfred Blunt, who is the author of The Art of Botanical Illustration. The greatest flower artists have been those who have found beauty in truth, who have understood plants scientifically, but who have yet seen and described them with the eye and hand of the artist. So botanical art really started just like a lot of other art forms did, before there were cameras, before there were ways of documenting certain things, such as portraits and landscapes. People were documenting them in painting or drawing or other ways of visual documentation. The oldest, they call it the Vienna Discoides, is the oldest document of botanical art. And it is an illuminated manuscript, and it documents a lot of different plants for medicinal purposes and cooking. And basically it was for scientific purposes, but the plants had to be drawn accurately. And for the most part, in the very beginning, that's what plants were documented for. It wasn't until after the Renaissance that people took the art of botanical illustration to the next level. And it wasn't until the early Renaissance when gardens, public botanical gardens came into play, that people were hired to paint a lot of the subjects that were in the botanical gardens. But before that, they were basically herbals that were documenting or depicting scientific illustrations of plants. So one of the, she's a pretty well-known botanical artist, not just because she was an artist, but Maria Sibylla Merian was an entomologist. And because she was a woman and because she was a scientist, which was very groundbreaking at the time, she was considered a pioneer in the scientific world. And she really loved bugs. So you can see in these two prints that are the branch of the West Indian cherry tree with an Achilles morpho butterfly. And the next one is the Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamesium. So she created these plates where she wanted to show the whole life cycle of the caterpillar. And believe it or not, people thought before entomologists started studying bugs that bugs kind of just appeared out of the dirt. But she kept a whole collection of caterpillars and watched their life cycle and painted them just really beautifully, even though they were more considered a scientific documentation. She was very talented and very artistic, and you could see how beautiful and also how realistic, and every little detail is documented about the plant, from the bud to the flower to the leaf, even the little leaves that the insects were eating on the bottom, just to show the whole scientific explanation of the plant. Somebody that you may not know that you know, Pierre Joseph Fred-Dutet, you may not know the name, but these prints are also very well known. You may have seen them in home goods stores and on China patterns. They're really very famous prints. And he came along in the 1700s. He was also a scientific painter. So a lot of his earlier work was more on a scientific scale, until he met Empress Josephine Bonaparte, Napoleon's wife. She purchased Malmaison, the big home in Paris, in France, and she had, I think, about 250 different species of roses. So she encouraged Fred-Dutet to paint roses and document all of her roses. He was hired by her to do all the plants in her garden. And because he became so perfected really the art of painting roses, he became known as the Rembrandt of roses, or the Raphael of flowers. And not that many artists at that time were really focusing on botanical art, but his paintings, you can see, are a little more artistic and less scientific at this stage. His prints were going for a pretty hefty sum. I think King Charles the 10th bought one of his original watercolors for 30,000 francs. So he was pretty well known and pretty made a nice living as a botanical artist. And the Bauer brothers were another set of artists, but they were also scientists. And they have their own, well, Franz became the resident botanical artist for the Kew Gardens in England. And he was also hired, and he made a nice salary and got all the perks of a royal artist, even though he wasn't painting for royalty, but he was hired as the painter resident artist for the garden. So a little bit about Alcatraz, and I'll tell you why this has some meaning for botanical artists. This garden was started many, many years ago when it was a prison. And for those of you that know anything about Alcatraz, it really was just a big rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean where they had the prison. They had to bring in all of this dirt and soil and created this garden between the prisoners and the corrections officers and the workers on Alcatraz. they wanted to have this sort of therapy to create gardens. They used it for their vegetables that they harvested themselves. And then the whole prison went into disarray. The gardens were abandoned in 1963. Then in 2003, the National Park Service and with the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, they restored the garden. So then they had a group of botanical artists come in and document all of the flowers. And they call this, this collection of flowers a florilegium. So all of the flowers were, each artist picked a different flower to paint and document. Some of them documented the whole life cycle of the plant. So the Northern California Society of Botanical Artists were the branch of botanical artists that did this. And they created the Florilegium, and in 2013, they exhibited to the public 45 works, which I chose 3 that are my favorite. Each one of them was really beautifully done, but I liked these 3. We have the Narcissus papyraceus Paperwhite by Martha McLaren. I'm not going to try to say all these names because I usually botch them up, but this is Buddleia lochnic, which is a butterfly bush. And then we have the Hollyhock by Judy Paris. So they were on display, and I was lucky enough to go see them. And here we have a picture of the New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx. One of my favorite places to go, and I highly recommend it for anybody that's never been there. You should go. It's amazing. It's a beautiful place. They have quite an education program. And this is where I took my very intensive botanical illustration course. It took me about 3 years to complete the course, but I would say I really learned a lot more from this program than I learned from any other program. Really, it was very, everything had to be learned from the ground up between the materials. And you start off with graphite and then colored pencil and all of the traditional media that botanical artists would use. And of course, they hold a very high standard, so you have to make sure all your work is up to their standard. And this is just some information about the magazine that comes out for botanical artists once a month if you belong to the ASBA, which is the American Society of Botanical Artists. And of course, there's the Society of Botanical Artists, which is in the UK. Oh, before I go to that, the American Society of Botanical Artists hosts a conference every year. And I do try to go to that one. It's held in different cities around the United States. The last one we went to in person, I believe, was in Pittsburgh. Of course, last year's was canceled, and this year, well, not canceled, but it's going to be virtual, just like this year's is going to be virtual. And the good thing about attending these conferences, if you become a member, is you get to work and see other artists from all over the world. And I feel like just because I've gotten my certification, you can always just keep learning. I enjoy workshops. I take workshops whenever I can with different artists because I feel like you can learn something from each and every artist that you study with. So they do have a lot of workshops and a lot of, just meeting with other artists is really a nice thing to the camaraderie. It's just, I enjoy those conferences. So this is one of my paintings. It's the tiger lily, Lilium lancifolium, which is the botanical name, which when you do work with botanical art, you do keep that scientific part of it. So you always kind of have to learn the Latin name and which genus and which family your subject is from. And of course, it's always painted from a live subject. So here is my tiger lily in my garden. These tiger lilies actually have gone from one house to another house, starting with my mother-in-law, and hopefully they're coming back this year. I think I see the leaves starting to peek through, but last year I didn't have one tiger lily. So I have my subject, and of course you are sketching, and I didn't cut this one and bring it in the house because I didn't want to cut it down. So I stood in my garden with my little ruler and my sketchbook, and I did many, many sketches and tried to get as accurate as possible with measuring all the leaves and measuring the stamens and the anthers and every little part of the plant, which is what you're supposed to do if you're going to create a botanical illustration. The leaves have to be correct, the stems, and I start off with a pencil drawing, and then after the pencil drawing, I outline all of my sketches with a micron pen to get a dark contour line before I transfer it to my watercolor paper. So transferring it to the watercolor paper is the last thing I do. I make all my mistakes, which of course I make many, on tracing paper. The thing that you don't want to do is draw on your good watercolor paper and then have to erase. So make as many mistakes as you want as on the tracing paper. It's cheap enough. You can start all over again if you want to. You can erase. But once you go to your good watercolor paper, you want to make sure that your drawing is exactly the right way that you want it to be. There should be no mistakes once in the drawing part. There's always plenty of mistakes, but some of them can be fixed and some of them can't. And that's the thing with watercolor. It's a very unforgiving medium, and there's not a lot of fixing up you can do like you can with oil paint or acrylic. So you're really taking your time, and I make my little color charts and make sure I know exactly what color I'm going to use before I go to my watercolor paper. There's a lot more prep work involved, I feel like. Here's another work in progress. This is an anemone, and that's the flower, and that's my little chart in the middle. You can see that I'm taking one of the petals and just really trying to figure out what colors I'm going to use. And then I usually write down the name of the paint that I'm going to use. Sometimes I forget, but I try to keep accurate records of everything that I'm going to use in my painting. Another painting I did was of the hibiscus, and of course I have the specimen, and I'm measuring the buds, and I'm checking the color of the leaves. And here we have, I start off with a pencil drawing, and then I added the butterfly, which again, I have the specimen of the butterfly. I always use a live specimen for whatever I'm painting. I have a pretty big collection of butterflies. And then in the third picture, you can see that I started laying down some washes. And this was my finished painting of the hibiscus. And another example is, this is one of the last paintings I worked on. You can see the first picture is the leaf that I drew, and it took me a pretty long time to draw that. There's a lot of details in a crumpled up leaf, but I thought that it was a really interesting subject, and it's from the princess tree. And I have the seed pods there, and again, you can see I'm using some Daniel Smith paint, which is one of the paints that I use, and I'm mixing up my colors, trying to get an accurate color for those seed pods. And you can see how I have some washes in the third picture once I actually have everything transferred. And sometimes you can see I draw some things on different sheets of tracing paper, and then I put it together on one watercolor paper. And this was the finished product of my princess leaf with the seed pods. And here we have some charts and charts and charts, and this is how you learn color mixing. And I don't want people to think that I just picked up a brush and just automatically knew how to paint and make watercolor. It's practice, practice, practice. I made so many charts, and it's really important to do this because watercolor kind of has a mind of its own. So you got to get a handle on knowing how to lay down a wash. And like I said, it's not as forgiving as some of the other media that you use. So especially in botanical illustration where everything is precise and your lines are precise, it's not that kind of watercolor where, you know, loose and goes all over the page and you kind of let it do what it wants to do, which is, you know, another beautiful way of painting with watercolor. It's just not how you paint in botanical illustration. Everything is accurate and precise and pristine, and your paper is just void of any mistakes or any extra blooms that you don't want. And that's the end of my presentation. So right now I'm going to show you some of my materials that I use. Let me get out of here. Okay, so hopefully you can see my desktop. So this is where I do my actual watercolor work. So here I just have an example of what I mean by doing some washes and learning how to put down a wash. But first I wanted to show you my palette, which is actually a plate from the Dollar Tree. And I actually love these because they're porcelain and they're white and they are a nice size, but they're only $1. So I have a bunch of these. And on my palette, I wanted to show you the colors that I use. So when you start off painting, and even some artists, whether they're working in oil or pastels or whatever medium that they're using, some artists only work with a limited palette. I don't always, but I think it's important to know that you can work with a limited palette and you can mix almost pretty much every color that you need with these 5 colors. I don't tend to use too much black, but this is one of the brushes that I use, and I do use a sable brush. So this is a Raphael, and I also use Winsor Newton Series 7. Let me get that brush. Series 7 Sable Kolinsky brush. Some of my brushes are very small. So this is a number 2. You could see how tiny those little bristles are. This is a number 1, even smaller. So sometimes I'm working with a really, really tiny brush, and I actually do love that. Some people may find this kind of painting tedious, or I don't know. It does take a lot of patience and it does take a lot of practice. But for me, it's like therapeutic. The painting, I don't know. I'm one of those color in the lines kind of people, I guess. So I do like this way of painting, but it does take a lot of practice. So these colors are cadmium yellow, which is a warm yellow, and lemon yellow, which is a cool yellow. So we have 2 different temperatures of yellow and 2 different temperatures of red. So we have a warm red here, and then this is Scarlet Lake. These are Winsor Newton paints. This is permanent rose, and this is ultramarine blue. So you can pretty much use these colors to mix just about any color that you need. Of course, I have tons of paint, tons of different colors because I like to have different colors. But when you first start out, using a limited palette will definitely help you learn how to mix colors and how to create different temperatures of colors and what they how they'll perform. I also wanted to show you, this is the paper that I use. This is Arches. I use hot pressed. So there's a hot press paper and a cold press paper. And the difference between the two is that hot press paper is really super smooth. I'll show you here. It's really smooth. So when you think about pressing, you think about ironing. It's really, there's no texture at all, but it is 100% cotton paper. And the cold press paper has a little more tooth to it and a little more texture. And that's not to say, and I never say one way is right and the other way is wrong, but some botanical artists will paint with cold press paper. I prefer the hot press, and the reason why is you can get a much more exact, precise line than you would with the cold press paper, because the cold press paper, because it has those little indentations, the paint will kind of bleed out. Whereas on the hot press paper, if you make a little line, it'll pretty much stay where you put it. So that's the paper that I use. Sometimes I use 140-pound paper, and sometimes I will use 300-pound paper, which is just a heavier piece of paper. Just to show you a little bit of my paints, I definitely use the tubes. I prefer these. I don't buy the pans. I don't know why, but I know they're pretty much the same thing, but I prefer the tubes, and I squeeze out a little bit on my palette and let them set for a bit. I don't ever really use them fresh out of the tube because they're just too intense. So you want to have them sit for a little bit and then reconstitute them with some water. I always have 2 containers of water, one to wash my brush, and the other one is always clean to pick up the paint or to put a wash on your paper. You always need clean water. And some people find that even a little difficult, trying to remember to stick your brush in one to clean it and then use the clean water for the other things. So just to show you a little bit of how I wet my paints, I use this cheapy synthetic brush. I never use my good brush to mix my paints because you'll smash the hairs on your brush if you do that. So if I wet my paints, and right now I'm going to make a grizzai, which is just a fancy word for gray. And that's used a lot of times in an underpainting, and even with oil paint, you can use a grizzai as your underpainting. So you use 3 primary colors, which is red, blue, and yellow. So these are primary colors, but we have a warm and a cool of each of the red and the yellow. There's also a warmer, no, a warmer blue. This is the blue that I use for my primaries. But so if you mix a little ultramarine blue with some Scarlet Lake or the permanent rose, it depends on if you want a cool gray or a warm gray. So I'm going for a warm gray. So I'm using my cadmium yellow. And I've got myself a nice gray for my underpainting. And the one thing about watercolor is you have to keep in mind all the time, and this is what most people have trouble with, is you are starting off very pale. You can always go darker, you can't go lighter. And it's kind of the opposite from oil paint or acrylic paint, where you do start dark and then you add your lights at the end. This is the exact opposite. The only light you have is the white of the paper, and you want to save some of that white of the paper. So that's why you start off very very light and then work in layers and adding them on. So just to show you that, here is how I drew my apple on a piece of tracing paper and then outlined it in my micron pen, which is this permanent ink pen, just to give it a nice outline so I could see it through the light box, and then transferred to my watercolor paper. So there's a few ways you can transfer your drawing to the watercolor paper. And like I said, when I'm painting botanical, I never draw right on the watercolor paper. Maybe some people do, but I know I'm going to make a mistake. It's just nature. You will make a mistake, and I need to erase and fix my lines. And however many times I have to redraw something, this is really inexpensive. So even if you destroy it, you can throw it in the garbage and take another sheet. The really good watercolor paper is expensive. And I always tell my students, if you're gonna buy materials, don't get the student grade paper. It's really just, you're gonna fight with it and you're gonna have terrible results. And I can tell when people tell me they made a mark and it dried instantly, it's because you're using student grade paper, which is made from paper pulp. It's not 100% cotton. So if you're going to splurge on something, some of your materials, buy the best paper. I had taken a watercolor class many, many years ago and wasn't really taught about the materials, and was so frustrated that I stopped painting in watercolor because I felt like I can't do this. I don't know how to paint with watercolor. But it was because no one explained the difference in the materials. If you use student grade paper and you have to put on a wash, before you get your paint back on the paper, your paper will be dry, and you need water for watercolor. So you need your paper to stay wet for a certain amount of time. So that's why I always recommend Arches is the best paper. There's other watercolor paper out there that are professional grade, but I prefer Arches. I think I have good results with that. So like I said, I do all my drawing on my tracing paper, and then I transfer it either through a light box, or you can also transfer your drawing by taking your drawing and turning it over and putting some graphite with your pencil around the back side of your drawing, and then turning it over again, and then pressing your pencil on top of your drawing, and then you'll have your transfer on your watercolor paper. Or you can use graphite paper. Some people like to use that, which is a piece of paper that you would sandwich in between your tracing paper and your watercolor paper. I don't like using that because I feel like it gets too much graphite on my watercolor paper. And for me, the less graphite, the better. And for yourself also, you don't want a lot of graphite on your paper because it tends to smudge. And the other thing that I do, once I get my drawing on here, I want it as light as possible. So I will also take a kneaded eraser and try and get up some of that graphite by just rolling it over the graphite. I never do this on my paper. You don't want to do that because that will start disturbing the fibers in your paper. And you want to treat the paper like it's a piece of silk. Really, really carefully. Sometimes I actually even use white cotton gloves while I'm painting, not to get my oils on the paper. These are all the things I've learned from different botanical artists. So I know it's very light, but I've picked up most of the graphite so that it won't interfere with my, sorry for those phone calls. I'm probably one of the few people left in the world that actually has a landline. Anyway, so here's my apple. And what I would start with when, the first thing I would start with most of the time, unless I'm painting a very pale flower, is a Grizzai Underpainting, which is there to give you the form of the shape that you're painting. So we know it's an apple, but it's basically a flat circle on a flat piece of paper. So to make something appear three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface, you have to give it some form, right? So I mixed up my Grizzai, and I'm going to start with a wet into wet wash. So I'm taking my clean water. Let me just move this over. And I already mixed up the three primary colors, and I'm taking my clean water and putting on a wash. And you can see in the light that sheen. You want to make sure that's even across your whole subject. And the thing about this paper is that it will stay wet. So, I mean, it may dry quicker because we have the air conditioner on now, but we'll see. So usually when I'm setting up my subject, I'm also setting it up in a way where I'm using scientific lighting, or better known as Rembrandt lighting. And this is not just for botanical art. This is for anything that if you're painting a still life, we have to use lighting on our subject. And the lighting will usually create different shadows and some highlights. So we want to save the highlight. And this is to help you describe the form. So if you are using value to create your form, which of course is what we do, we want to show that where your subject is moving away from the light is the darkest, and where the light is hitting is of course going to be, this is a little dark and it looks even darker on the screen. I typically wouldn't go this dark, but also to keep in mind that watercolor dries much lighter. So we're going to create the form of the apple by painting in the value. So we've got dark around, I'll just go ahead and make it a little darker so it's easier to see. We're going to create dark where the light is not going to be. So when we use scientific lighting, your highlight is right here because you imagine that light to come over your left shoulder and hit that point on your subject. That's going to be your lightest light, and where it's moving away from the light is going to be your darkest. And there's always that dark core shadow on the opposite side of your highlight. So this would be where your core shadow is, and knowing that there would be a little bit of reflected light down here on the bottom, that light that comes around the other side of your subject. And let's see, this was a green apple, so it's okay to have a little bit of a dark underpainting. Sometimes if I'm painting a white flower or a very pale flower, I might not use a Grizzai underpainting at all. But this part of the apple would be the lightest. And it is drying very quickly, so I'm going to try to get a little more value in here where that core shadow is. And like I said, I'm gonna just get it a little bit darker just so that you can see what I mean by core shadow. It's basically a crescent shaped shadow that would be on the exact opposite side of where the highlight is. And this is the part that most people have trouble with, is having patience for it to dry. So you have to have this dry completely, because once you start adding layers on top, you don't want it to appear muddy. I would also put a little shadow down in here because this is inside the apple, and we want that to have darkness because we know the apple, the stem is inside there. So then this would have to dry. You don't want to put another layer on while it's wet. Some people might use a blow dryer. I don't typically use a blow dryer, but let's see. So this might be now with the Grizzai and with a wash of local color. So local color meaning what is the color that we see mostly in the subject? And I did make this green by using the same limited palette. So most people learn in elementary school that blue and yellow makes green, but what kind of green are we looking for? Are we looking for a warm green or are we looking for a cool green? And that's what you're always doing when you're looking at your subject. You're trying to figure out what colors are underneath, what colors are shining through your subject. And because it's watercolor, of course, we want it to appear transparent. So I always test my colors once I mix, before I even put it on my watercolor paper. Is it going to be this warm? Is it going to be this warm green? I don't know. Let's see. Maybe I need it a little bit cooler. So maybe I would add a little bit of the lemon yellow. But the less colors you have, the less confusing it is to mix. So that's why I always say start with a limited palette and get to know your colors really well so that you know what colors you will need to make a certain hue. So maybe that's a little too blue. And sometimes it takes a little while to make sure you're mixing the right color. Maybe that's the right color. So the next thing I would do is do another wet into wet wash, meaning that my paper is wet, the paint is very wet and very transparent. And I've already put a wash on here and you can see where the underpainting is, but I'm going to put another wash on top. And again, I'm going to wet. Sometimes I do 2 to 3 wet into wet washes before I go to wet into dry, meaning the paint is still pretty wet, but my paper is dry. And You can see here where I've left that little highlight. And again, certain things are going to have a brighter highlight, like an apple, because it's very shiny. There might be flowers that are very pale and very translucent, might not have very bright highlight, but certain fruits and vegetables like eggplant and peppers, they're really shiny, and you want to be able to show that by leaving some bright, bright, bright highlight. So now I've got my green. And I'm still leaving that little highlight. So I'm trying to avoid that. And there's usually a highlight at the top on that rim. But when you set up your subject and you light it that way, you will see where the highlights are. And of course, I have that little bit of reflected light on the bottom. And I've got another wash on here. And you'll notice in botanical illustration, there's usually no cast shadows. And a cast shadow would be the shadow under the subject. I'll actually demonstrate what I mean by a cast shadow. They usually just look like they're floating in space. And that's the idea of botanical illustration. There's not supposed to be any distractions or any shadows. You're just documenting or depicting the subject, and that's all really we're looking at. So a cast shadow is the shadow that the subject makes if it's sitting on a surface, but we're not showing that. We're just showing it kind of floating in space. But anyway, so again, I'm going to mix up another wash. And this time I'll go a little bit heavier. So it's the same combination of colors, but now I'm going to use more pigment, which is the paint, and less water because I want to start building up a heavier layer. So I'm mixing the cool yellow and the warm yellow. And the ultramarine blue. And again, I will test it on my paper just to make sure. That's a little too blue. Let's go for a little more yellow. And I'll test it again, and I think that's pretty good. A little, and the thing about some of your paints also is you want to really study which paints are transparent, which paints are opaque, because some of them do different things, and some of them are permanent, which means that they cannot be lifted, such as permanent rose. When they say permanent, it means permanent. If I took my permanent rose right now and painted on my paper, and then try to lift some of it off with a tissue. You might get some of it off when it's still wet, but it's permanent. it doesn't come off. So you got to check your color swatches, and that's why I've done all those color swatches myself to learn which colors are transparent, which ones are opaque, which ones will lift, which ones won't. When you mix your colors on top of each other, because sometimes you put a glaze on top of another color, and that gives a different effect. So all these things you learn by just practicing making charts with your watercolor. So this is pretty dry. So now I'm not wetting my apple with any water. I'm just going to go in there with another wash of this Granny Apple Green. And you can see as I'm putting more layers, it starts to become a shiny surface. And I'm still trying to leave those highlights up here. And I'll go back in here with a little I'm holding my brush pretty close to the ferrule of the brush, which is the metal part. I hold my brush like I'm holding a pencil because I feel like I have more control over it. So then this would have to dry. So then let's see, we've got this one, which has a few layers. And then I've also added the cast shadow of the stem, which that's fine, you can do that. But no cast shadow under your subject. So this apple tends to be a little greener. So now we're going to put on a glaze over this because I want to tone it down just a bit. So I'm going to put on a very light wash of the green, but it's more blue because I feel like it's a little too bright and a little too saturated with the green. So if we put on a glaze, which is a very, very pale, transparent mix of the paint, it will bring that saturation of green down a little bit. And again, I'm avoiding that little highlight. Doesn't have to be that large, but so just that glaze of the, it's still green, but it's more blue than it is yellow. And this is what is so wonderful about watercolor. You can layer a glaze over your dry watercolor and bring it to a different temperature or a different value. And now this actually looks a little closer to what I want it to be. And of course we have the stem. I'm just going to, sometimes I'm just using some clean water to just move the paint around. And that would have to dry a little bit. And then I would come back in here because I don't want this to look so blue. And how did I get that brown for the stem? So again, the stem also is a form. You don't want to have it just look like a straight line. So in order to give it some form or dimension, there's got to be a side where it's highlighted and a side where there's a shadow, or the darker side where it's away from the light. So let's mix that brown. So just so you believe me when I say you can mix pretty much any color with this limited palette. So if we mix a green with the blue and the yellow, and if anybody knows their color wheel, you know that if you add opposites on the color wheel, you'll get a neutral. So by mixing red and green, which are opposite on the color wheel, you will get a brown. Let's make that a little darker. So I've got my Scarlet Lake, which is the warm red. And I'm mixing the green with the blue and the yellow. And it's kind of like a burnt sienna, but let's get it a little darker by adding a little more blue. And we've got a nice dark brown. So by taking that dark color and carefully darkening that one side of the stem, you'll show that you've got light hitting the left side, and on the right side, which is further away from the light, it's darker. And of course, this bottom part of the stem would be darker because it's inside the apple. And then after many, many layers, we have a finished Granny Smith apple. And Granny Smith apples usually have those little dots. And the way we get that is by lifting. And that I use I call it my scrubby brush. It's a synthetic. This is a real cheapy brush I bought in Michael's many years ago, but it's got a stiff little bristle and it's really small. So I use this for lifting, and you can lift certain things in your watercolor. Not everything is easily lifted, but if you wet your brush, and actually I'm going to show it on this one. I'm going to show it on this one, but if you wanted to lift up to make those little dots, you take your scrubby brush and you kind of just go back and forth and take your tissue, and hopefully you can see that tiny little dot. And there's another little dot. Sometimes I use masking fluid for certain things. Masking fluid is, so now you can see the little dots that I made. This is masking fluid. Nope, that's not masking fluid. This is masking fluid. So this you would put down on your paper with a very, very inexpensive brush, because this will ruin your brush, or sometimes I use a skewer or a toothpick or something else. You put the masking fluid down before you paint and let that dry completely, at least a few hours. And then when you paint over the masking fluid, it keeps the white of the paper. So some people might want to use masking fluid to put those little dots in before you paint. I don't feel that it's necessary. I think this is, you know, a perfectly fine way, because you don't want the dots really white anyway, because they have some pigment in it. They're really not white. But anyway, that's my apple demo, and that's my finished apple. So if anybody has any questions. about materials or my class.
So if anyone has any questions, you can put your questions in the chat room and we can answer them for you. Liz teaches a class on Mondays from 1:30 to 4:30. Next session actually starts 2 weeks from now. Well, it's a week from Monday, actually. Nope, 2 weeks from Monday, I tell a lie. And it will run for another 4 weeks. So if you are interested, it looks like someone's raised their hand. If you have, please put your speaker on. Let's see, what have we got? No, I don't see that. Someone in the chat room. Here we go. Okay, this is from Stephanie Saxon. Lovely painting. Do you use a warm grisaille if the topic is cool and vice versa?
That's a good question. So I guess, yes, for certain things, if it's like an eggplant, I would probably use a cooler gray. The Granny Smith apple to me is a warm color, so I wanted to use a warmer grisaille, warmer gray underneath.
Okay, Deborah Ahern, she says, do you use special lighting to get the Rembrandt lighting?
I do. I have a whole setup on my desk here. I usually put my subject, either if it's a flower, I'll put it in a vase, and I have it lifted where it's eye level. And I have a, I don't have the setup to show you, but I use foam core, and I kind of create this little box where it's surrounding the subject, and then I put a piece of foam core on top, and then I put a light shining it in that area where it would be the Rembrandt lighting, so that it blocks out any other ambient light. It's just a small light hitting the subject for the purpose of lighting it up.
Anyone else have a question? Anyone else? Liz, do you have a particular type of paint that you recommend over another?
The brand of paint?
Yeah.
So I do most of the time use Winsor Newton, but I also use Daniel Smith, and I also use Schmincke sometimes. I like them all. There's really, I mean, certain colors I like from certain brands, but I have an abundance of paint, an abundance of different colors. So to contradict what I said before about the 5 basic limited palette colors, you can certainly do most of your painting with the limited palette, but I like to buy paint.
Anybody else have any questions? Hang on, there looks like there might be one in here. Let's see, what have we got here? Oh, this is from Nicholas Fusco. Great job, Mum, your son.
Thanks, Nick.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Does anyone have any questions about the class? You're welcome to ask that as well.
We usually paint a different subject for each session, because it does take time to really draw the subject and then work out I try not to rush and do more than one subject per session. So, you know, taking our time to make a nice composition, that takes time. Drawing everything out accurately takes probably the first class. And then it just does take time to do the painting. So this class we're painting purple calla lilies. I'm not sure what will be the next one, but you know, it'll be something beautiful.
Okay, anybody else? No more questions? Give it maybe 1 minute, see if anyone else wants to come on. Okay, so we have, thanks very much for the informational talk. I learned a lot.
Good.
That's from Stephanie Saxon. Okay, I think looks like that's it for questions. Is there anything else you need to add to that, Liz?
No, I welcome anybody that wants to take the class. It's a beautiful studio at the Atelier if you've not been there. And it's as precise as the painting and drawing is. I'm a pretty relaxed instructor, and it's fun. It's a lot of fun and not a lot of pressure, and everybody works at their own pace and has their own skill level, but it's all about learning and having fun and really enjoying the act of painting.
One other question actually just came in. How thick is the foam core? I presume that's to make the box with.
Oh, I actually buy the foam core at the Dollar Tree. Dollar Tree is my favorite place to go. I use foam core also to these little demos are on my desk, but I use the foam core to actually tape my subject on. Sometimes I will work directly on, this is what you would call a block. So the paper is sealed on all sides of the pad, and you can see that there's like a little bit of space where you can take the paper off at the end. But if I'm not working on the block, I take the piece of paper off individually and tape it on a foam core board. And I buy those a lot at Dollar Tree because they're cheap and you can cut them into smaller sizes. But I guess it's, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch thick.
I think that's a fairly standard size for foam core. You can get a 1/2 inch, but I wouldn't think that's right for your purposes.
No, and if it gets cruddy, I throw it out and buy another one because they're very cheap.
Right, any other questions? Okay, I think that's probably it. If anyone does have any other inquiries about the classes, please feel free to call the Atelier. That's 631-250-9009. We'd be happy to answer any questions. Right, so I think that's probably it for tonight. We'll wrap that up. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for everyone who came on.
Okay, so I would like to thank Elizabeth Fusco for giving such an interesting talk and demonstration on botanical illustration. We hope you both found it both engaging and informational, interesting. We should also like to thank First Republic Private Wealth Management again for this generous sponsorship of tonight's program. Our next lecture will be on environmental art and design, and we welcome back Mark Fasanella, who will be giving that talk. He has actually been teaching that as a class at Stony Brook for many years. Please look out for our email about this lecture and other upcoming events and classes. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.